The realm was beauteous and plentiful, its people more so. No plague touched its borders, no famine its lands. War was seldom seen in this kingdom, whose peaceful lords ran their fortified estates in harmony with one another. The only problem was that peasants were treated harshly, scraping to live on the scraps of land provided to them by their lords. Besides this, the nobles were amiable and open with their dealings with one another, with one exception. In the southernmost castle of this bountiful landscape lived an estranged baron and his wife. Though seldom seen, they were both said to be startlingly beautiful youths, albeit rather sallow. Despite this, the Baron Krav and his young wife Adelaida were a reclusive couple, only leaving their citadel in the utmost emergency. They never attended holiday feasts or tourneys held by the noblemen. The knights of their court were seldom seen in the festive jousts. It was therefore a shock when it was said that the Baron was to throw a jousting tournament in honor of his wife's naming day. There was to be a feast following the events of the day, which would continue late into the night and into the early hours of the next morning. The noblemen and women were ecstatic for the event. Knights trained, ladies gossiped, and nobles prepared their families for the festivities. All the while the small folk would notice caravans of food, decor, lavish cloths, and other such things passing through their towns, bound south to the domain of the Baron. This change was very sudden and new for the people of the land, who fantasized about the celebration to come. The day of the feast approached quickly. Those of higher birth donned their best attire, knights bore their armor, and everyone from the northern domains all the way to the south packed and left for the journey to Castle Grove. As the numerous families traversed through foggy wetlands and dense woods, a startling sight met their eyes, the dark and grasping spires of Castle Grove. Each dark stone tower clawed its way into the sky, casting a gloomy and dismal aura about the battlements. While none could deny the macabre aspects of the castle, it also had an air of beauty, with its lush birch forest and surrounding grounds. And although the castle was undeniably unsettling, it too had aspects of beauty in its cold stone walls. It was these sights that greeted the ecstatic nobles and knights, as they completed the final stretch to the festivities. Upon entering Castle Grove, the revelers were led to various wings of the estate, in which they could clean themselves and rest from their travels for the evening to come. An hour after the last guests arrived, a servant of the house announced that the first of the jousts were to begin promptly. Lords and ladies greeted each other exuberantly in the decorated halls of the mighty, elegant fortress as the knights and squires proceeded to the field where the joust was to be held. The pageantry of the Krov family hung proudly from the halls and streamed from the tops of walls and towers. The heraldry of knights flew from tents, horses, and tabards, and the excited chitterings of near 100 highborns could be heard through the entirety of the arena. Finally, another herald in the service of the Krovs announced that his lord and lady would not be attending the jousts. He apologized hastily on behalf of his benefactors, and swiftly departed. A small cry of dissent sounded from the amassed guests, but was swiftly silenced as the castle's master of arms entered the field to commence the first match. Horses charged, lances broke, knights rolled in the dirt. The crowd cheered their favorites and booed their rivals, all the while gossiping and chatting away. By the time of the final match, everyone's voice was hoarse from overuse, yet their enthusiasm did not wane. After the sun had started to set and the winner of the day's events had been announced, the noble families retreated to their temporary chambers to prepare themselves for the evening's feast. Lords and ladies clothed themselves in their finest raiments, planning to outdo each other in beauty and wealth. Long embroidered gowns of the finest silks and velvets were strewn about the shoulders of well-off women. Men in doublets of lavish textiles, decorated by the rarest gems, led their families through the torchlit halls of Castle Grove, making their way to the heart of the fortified manor, the banquet hall. Rows of delicately carved tables lined with cushioned benches filled the room, save for a large central area serving for a dance floor. Once everyone was seated, a loud musical flourish was played by the heralds of the castle to announce the entrance of the Baron and his wife. The room became immediately hushed, all attention drawn to the ornately engraved door on the farthest wall of the room. The doors were pushed open, and in came a small stream of household servants, a few dressed in varying arrays of finery, handmaidens to the young baroness. A small escort of the castle's resident knights followed behind, each sporting their colors on elaborately embroidered tunics. Finally came Crov and Adlata. Lords and ladies alike gasped in stupor at the young nobles. Both were dressed in the colors of the Crov family, red and gray. Both were also infinitely more stunningly beautiful in person than any of the stories had told. Adlata was a charming and sprightly girl seemingly of around 20 years of age. Her hair fell in ebony ringlets around her shoulders and down her back. A circlet of silver inlaid with garnets rested lightly on the brow of her ivory flesh. Her dark lush ruby lips curved in a slight smile as she gazed over the crowd with stunningly pale green eyes. The long sleeves of her red gown almost brushed the ground, embroidered with intricate braided silver along the edges. The other youth, Lord Crov, was also pleasing to the eyes, causing the hearts of the younger maidens to skip a beat. His dark hair was worn short, though it still fell about his eyes. His strikingly pale skin mimicked his bride's, unnatural for the location of their southern home. Crov stood at an average height amongst his peers, yet he seemed to have dominating, almost feral air to him. His fine-boned, lupine face scanned the crowd of nobles assembled. He had no smile playing upon his lips, and bore a look of what seemed to be disinterest. "My lords and ladies of the realm, I thank thee kindly for coming upon such short notice. My lady wife is very dear to me, and it greatly pleases both I and her that thou hast all arrived. It has been ages since we have had such a feast," rang out the voice of the baron, who proceeded to laugh deeply and unnervingly. Too late. The nobleman realized the knights of Crov's court had blocked off any means of escape from door or window. Lady Adlata grinned fully now, revealing unnaturally sharp canine teeth. The handmaidens and servants of the baroness and baron began rushing through the crowds, snatching lords and ladies from their seats and dragging them to the corners of the hall to be fed upon. Surviving nobles fled to the exits futilely, blocked by the armed guards of the castle. Many guests attempted to plead with the baron and baroness, offering land, wealth, loyalty, and servitude. These attempts were made in vain however, and many of these whimpering lords and ladies became the blood feast for the fair Lady Adlata or her lover Crov. Blood bedecked the banquet hall, and the court of Castle Crov had a feast as none had ever seen before, nor ever had wished to see again. The peoples of the land reviled the southern realm of Crov, yet no commoner complained to the liberation of the realm from their pompous liege lords. It is still said amongst the peasants that any who wander past Castle Crov on the darkest autumn night, shall hear the screams of those damned to a bloody fate amongst the vampires of Crov's court. Credit to Nefertam. The following is a description of one exact point in time. It is exactly 1:04:23.215 a.m. On the second story of a quaint little home in suburbia is a hallway. The hallway begins at the top of the staircase and ends with a door. The oak of the portal and entry are stained smooth, comfortably conversing with the ashen paint surrounding its gateway. Inside aforesaid door is a master bedroom, occupied by a bed, occupied by a happily married couple. The ruby light of the alarm clock glows minimally in the corner, atop a matching oak nightstand. On the wall opposite the door hangs a window, blinds down, curtain pulled. The fan on the floor is turned to on, an action ingrained deeply from their previous city apartment, but now routine even in the quiet environs. The man and his wife are facing the same way, away from the tiresome glare of the clock. The man's hand rests on his wife's belly, which has a small bump. Near the end of the hallway, the door closest to the master bedroom is wide open. The walls are half-painted baby blue. A crib is mostly assembled in the middle of the room, atop a sheet of plastic that extends to all four walls. The radiance of the full moon breasts the thinly white blinds, illuminates the room, and pours gently into the hallway. The next, and last, door in the hall is slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack lies an open bed, the covers hurriedly thrown across it, exposing the emptiness of it. Inside the room, at the foot of the bed, is a toy box. A few of the toy box's occupants lie on the floor. On the wall opposite the bed is a closet, the door of which is open. The beams of the moon cast onto that wall, but could not penetrate the darkness of the open closet. Between the hanging shirts stood a shadowy figure no taller than 4 feet. Its eyes were fixated on the door to the hall. Outside of this room, on the other side of the hallway, is the staircase. On the stair, facing the bottom, is a young boy. His face is contorted into panic, his eyes frozen in fear, his mouth slightly open. His right hand firmly gripped the wooden railing and his bare feet are pressed against the hard stair. On the first floor of the house, around the corner from the bottom of the stairs, was the kitchen. The stainless steel appliances minimally reflected the moon, the angle of which only cast small amounts of light at the foot of each ground floor window. Between the island of many drawers and the stovetop stood a dark figure. Its presence could only be visible by the contrasted glimmer of sharp utensils and appliances surrounding it. The time on the microwave's clock reads 0 o'clock. Connected to the kitchen is the family room. There is one large, cushioned recliner in the corner and a love seat across the wall, in the middle. In the middle of the family room is a coffee table. An empty coaster and several different brands of magazines lie on its surface. The window behind the love seat cast a dim light onto the TV on the opposite wall of the room, which reflected back onto the glass of the coffee table. Sitting on the love seat is another shadowed figure. On the far side of the family room is the entryway. The door to the outside is dead-bolted. At the entrance is a welcome mat. The word welcome is slightly obscured by 3 different pairs of shoes. On the wall to the left of the entrance is a coat closet, closed and locked without a key. The inside of the closet is completely empty, no warm garments to be found. However, on the floor of the closet is some loose oak flooring. Underneath the unfastened floorboards is an open cellar. The air is thick. The ground is bare and cold. There are several wooden support beams that lead to the floor of the house. Across ceiling of the room are more wooden beams. Across one of these beams, in the center of the cellar, are 3 knots of old rope. The knots are tight in the beams on which they are fastened to show signs of wear and scratch near the fibrous ties. The ropes extends downwards to the floor, hooping around the necks of decomposed bodies. Hanging there, a man, a woman, a child, the previous owners. Credit to Jordan Louis owners. The trading ships had arrived in Venice from Kaffa only 2 days ago. The summer solstice had come and passed and now the days were hot and heavy with humidity. The piers were alive with the sound of activity and excitement. I could smell the tang of varnished wood, the stale odor of stagnating water, the enticing aroma of goods being unloaded from the ships, exotic spices from the Far East, their scent hinting at the strange and wondrous places of their origin. I was on my way to the marketplace. Usually, I did not have the money to purchase anything of value, but I still enjoyed the experience. I would sit near the outskirts and watch, a detached spectator, and imagine the luxury goods I would one day be affluent enough to buy. Then no longer would I be merely a spectator, but an open contender in the commerce. A childish daydream, but one that gave me a welcoming reprieve from the daily grind of life. However, today was different. I was here to buy a gift for my sister's wedding with a small sum of money I had saved for the occasion. And a splendid occasion it was going to be. Her fiancé was an upper-middle-class man, a well-known merchant. This was an opportunity for my family, and, in times such as these, opportunities were not to be squandered. The marketplace was crowded, too much so to be entirely comfortable. I could hear the irritated voices of the customers, berating the merchants, attempting to bargain down the exorbitant prices. In one vendor's stall, I saw the drying, blackening carcasses of 3 pigs, their strong smell mingling with that of exquisite perfumes and spices, meshing to create something disconcerting, almost nauseating. Finding the perfect gift was going to be difficult. The merchandise was either much too costly or simply raw materials, which would be laughably crude for such an occasion. Then I saw it, an iridescent silken scarf from the far-off Orient, elegantly emblazoned with a red and black flower, one foreign to this land. As I started to haggle with the merchant over price, I became distracted by 2 men at a neighboring stall, heatedly arguing over some outrageous rumor percolating through the marketplace. "I tell you, the devil was aboard that ship," said one with an uncomfortable and superstitious fervency. "They said that 2 men died, their flesh rotting off as they still lived." "It was 6 that died," countered the other, "but it was the spice. It gave them fever and black spots. They are calling it Black Death. They have thrown away the entire cargo." "No, the sailors saw the devil, 3 went overboard." And so it went. The marketplace was, generally, rife with such stories, which I found were invariably traceable to the effects of long voyages and the imagination of bored sailors. In my opinion, such fanciful devil stories were nothing short of preposterous. I finished bargaining with the merchant, concluded my purchase, and started on my way home. The day was coming to an end. The sun hung low on the horizon, a bloated sanguinary tinged disk, filling the evening sky with its dull red glow. I was well on my way back. As I walked along the piers, I heard the sound of children laughing. I noticed a group of 3 boys who looked no older than 10, gathered in a circle. As I got closer I was able to make out words, threats of obscene violence: "Stab its eyes out, break its bones, tear its ears off." And then I saw it, a small kitten with jet black fur. The boys were tormenting it with the disturbing and unwarranted cruelty of which young boys are so often capable. It almost made sense. The animal had most likely been thrown off a ship due to the recent rumors and prevailing superstitions. I felt a hot flash of anger. I had once had a cat, a large male with silky black fur which I had named Zito. He had brought me nothing but fortune. My father had been a merchant at the time. He had found him on a ship and he was a fine mouser. When my father would leave on long voyages, Zito would keep me company. He would sit on my bed, while I watched the ships from the window, hoping my father was returning with them. Then one day my father left and never returned. Reports later confirmed, he had died in a shipwreck. I was devastated. Zito sat with me, comforting me through this time of despair and grief, a last link to my father. Those times were long past now, and Zito, like my father, was merely a memory. I angrily strode into the group of boys and grabbed one of their sticks and broke it. "Get out of here!" I shouted and roughly pushed the nearest one. They scattered, running off, laughing senselessly. I picked the kitten up. It was trembling, every muscle tensed. I thought of Zito and stroked it till it calmed. "You will be just like Zito," I whispered. "You will be a great mouser and a loving companion and you will bring me fortune, but," I noted wryly, scratching my arm, "you will not be sleeping in my bed until we get rid of these fleas." I put the kitten in my coat pocket and continued home. Credit to Milo de Olivares. I have no idea how much longer I'll be able to do this. If I can no longer continue my aimless escape from simply running out of money, I could at least count my blessings. It's too difficult for me to say in confidence why the visions I've been having are persistent. Either they're a way for her to salt the meat per se, or a way for her to persuade me to keep my distance. However, they've become increasingly more vivid, so the best hypothesis is probably that she's been toying with me. Calling for help doesn't necessarily appear to be the smartest choice. Why? I don't know if there are others like her, and such a claim is too far-fetched for the police to believe. I really should have just kept to myself. If only. Yeah, it wouldn't have ended up like this. Why was I so stupid? It's probably just that one person though. Otherwise, I may have seen more of them in the visions by now. My first encounter with her was just earlier in autumn this year. Of all times, it was during my first semester at Duisburg University. Where I first met this person, if that's even an accurate term, was a place most people like myself would go because of the necessity. Like every other freshman in college, it was mandatory that I'd attend English 100 at some point to obtain a degree. Walking inside the classroom for the first time, it was already filled with people my age who I never met in my life. She was no exception. Just as I sat down in this room full of strangers, the professor, with an extra dash of enthusiasm in his voice, introduced himself as Professor Robinson. Probably as an exercise for the students to begin getting to know one another, we would stand up one by one, tell the class our names, and one thing about ourselves. The teacher grinned, raised one eyebrow at me, and said that since I was late, I'd go first. Standing up, the small sea of faces turned to me. With a tiny quiver in my jaw, I told the crowd, hi. My name is Billy Weisener, and I don't know anyone here. Sitting down, my eyes caught several other students smirking and nodding. Other members of the class stood up as well, giving their names, and telling us things like their majors, hobbies, and more irrelevant facts about themselves. The last of them, just one row in front and 2 seats to the left of where I sat, was more hesitant to stand than the rest. Where some of them took maybe a second to rise before the class, this ebony-haired student took a few seconds longer. Looking around the room as though she was scanning the room, she told us, hello. She turned her head around the room once more, looking at us all individually. I guess, I'm Allison Baker. I've been noted in the past for my keen sense of hearing, so it's not certain to me if others caught her murmuring, I think. Allison. Usually, the lack of eloquence would have made me feel no such thing towards her. However, from the second when she first stood before us, I felt a strange fixation on this person. It was nothing remotely romantic, or even sexual. There was absolutely no desire on my part to even touch. It was her very lack of eloquence that repelled me from the thought. The attraction was more magnetic, so to speak. Somehow, she implanted something into my brain. It was unnatural because I've never felt this form of magnetism before. There were no urges to do, but only to follow. At the second, stuttered mention of her name, her face began to redden. Initially, it seemed to be simple shyness. Her behavior sprouted confusion in me, and probably the other students there at what followed. We watched as she clenched her temples, and began to hyperventilate. With her extremely heavy breaths came tears going down her cheeks. Covering her face, she ran out of the room. Giving expressions of awe and confusion, the rest of us turned to one another, as if someone would have an answer to the obvious question. We briefly debated among ourselves whether or not it was best for someone to check on this person. It was almost involuntarily that I shut up, insisting to go. Typically, someone like me would be slow to interacting with others. Thus, it struck me as especially odd since I had no arguing with myself about it. Somehow, it was like the instinct to search for food to quell hunger. If anything, this kind of response felt even more necessary. At telling them that I'd go, that's when my mind let in only a little bit of second thought. I knew not of her personality, so there was no way that could have compelled me. Hell, it wasn't even the stranger's appearance, as shallow as it would have been. If anything, this person appeared pretty plain, dressing in the current fashion of my still teenage group. The only uncommon features of such were the locks of ebony, and a somewhat pale tone of flesh. Still, I found myself leaving the classroom despite my weaned sense of logic struggling to persuade me not to. Its efforts to persuade me that doing so would only end badly was quickly hushed. Only a moment of roaming through the hallways, and that hungry magnetism took over. There was no way for me to know her whereabouts with my eyes, even though the whole campus was brightly lit with fluorescence. However, something else kicked in. It was a sense I never knew of before. It's safe to say that it really wasn't quite human. This was similar to tracking by smell, where there was somewhat of a given path before me. This track was really more of the feeling of the air. Everything else around that given path was left to be as is. The invisible road before me was that of a low, metallic sound that gave a scratching, electric pulse to the center of my brain. The consistent scraping against my pituitary gland was wearing out any ability to think cognitively. That magnetism was the only, and the closest thing to thought I was experiencing. Where this electric pathway felt colorful in nature, everything else was graying. It was a slow, crawling decay spreading from inside out. All sound was muffled nearly to the point of perfect silence as well, with the exception of a faint ringing. As I continued to follow this trance-inducing road to the main lobby, my ears picked something up. Over the continuous ringing sound, there was a series of breathing that became louder while I walked. They were deep and sickly, as those of an old man with a terminal illness on his deathbed. The volume of this strange noise stopped increasing once it dominated the ringing. It wasn't the only, or probably the strangest thing I've heard then. Jesus Christ, I can't tell if that was her peering from just out the window. If this is the last part of my story I'm able to tell you, please search for my remains at the Motel 6 in Stanton, Ohio. The motel is on Oak Street, 7 miles northeast from the university. Even if I've completely disappeared, and I'm not able to complete this, you might at least find strands of DNA. I don't see anything out my window now, but I think that was a silhouette looking at me from the distance. It's too dark out to make anything out, but the shape looked distinctly like her. God, those eyes. Those glowing eyes shining at me. The tiny specks of lime green I saw through my window for just a moment, they were watching me. I've only started praying for my life. I don't know what else I can do, but maybe continue my futile escape. I just hope someone heard me praying. I don't see that alien figure now. Even if it was pitch black outside. I'll have to check out early, and run in the rain, so hopefully, this journal of sorts isn't lost. At the moment, I'm continuing this from the lonely table of the mostly empty Denny's I drove to. Other than the night staff, a couple other people eating and keeping to themselves, and me sitting at my booth, it's pretty much dead in here. The only other sounds consist of clanging and sizzling from the kitchen, and the television broadcast being changed from the news to pure static. The broadcast itself died out from the very instant I sat down, and a pudgy, frizzy-haired waitress seems rather dumbfounded by it. With a frustrated look on her face, she keeps insisting that by changing the channel, the static will stop. Given that I know nothing about weather, I can't make any educated guesses. However, given that there's only a stream of heavy rain, it seemed uncanny to me. Where I'll go after eating to help calm my nerves, I haven't planned. Although I'm a bit soaked from running to and from my car in the heavy rain, my laptop is at least safe. I continued down the hallway of the university. Along with the stream of breaths, my ears picked up bits of her voice. It was much like turning a dial to tune into a radio station, but with no static. There were light, indistinguishable groans of hers going in and out, and then words. The groans drifted into her saying, "Baker, servant of the... It's Scry calls us." About to turn the corner to the next hallway to my left, I saw a shadow lurking against the wall of that hallway. Given how the lights in the school smothered every surface, how this occurred still makes me wonder. My pupils couldn't catch a decent glimpse at its form though, seeing its dashing speed further down the hall just beyond me. The strange, electric sensation to the core of my brain came to a sudden cease. A rather small, warm breeze that etched through the first layer of my skin approached me just as she did. How she appeared before me was beyond my expectations though. Even though she left the classroom red in the face with water going down her cheeks, she didn't look as such in the halls. Her face was as pale as it was when class started. Her face was perfectly expressionless. It was as if she was never upset at all. As she came closer to me, I instinctively asked what happened. There was no reply from her, or even a passing glance. She was walking at a far quicker pace than I could follow without going into a sort of light trot. I followed her back to class, and while she gained more distance from me, I heard another of those whisperings. Although she was several feet in front of me, it sounded as though she was centimeters from my ears. Humankind does sense no surroundings. I see all time. And between the words I could make out were more unintelligible murmurs, too vague to repeat. Awaken, awaken, and demise. The inexplicably alluring girl closed the door behind her, allowing it to shut with a startling bang. Going back inside, my body rested back into where it sat before my search. I found myself staring at her more closely the time around, unsure if perhaps others felt that alien magnetism as well. Considering all the other students were seated, I couldn't tell. A few other students who were sitting near her asked how she was doing. With an oddly whimsical smirk, she assured them that she was fine. If anything, there seemed to be a hint of confusion in her voice as to why they were asking to begin with. After so many confirmations, the professor continued with whatever lesson he had planned. I was still unusually fixated by this stranger's presence. As intense as it was, I still couldn't figure out why. Somehow, she beckoned me to come closer. It was perhaps a similar attraction a raccoon has to grabbing a shiny object before realizing its hand's been caught in some painful trap. Maybe I wasn't the only one though. Near me, another guy in the class, whose name I'll refuse to mention for respect of his family, was murmuring back and forth with her. Also trying to hear what the professor was saying was more than likely what hindered me from really picking up what they were saying. To my futile attempts, I could only try to give some of my attention to the lesson. The best I could do was eye contact, and hearing a quarter of the things he was saying. I'm not sure what it was, but I believe it was something regarding a persuasive paper. The majority of my focus was hearing a proposal by the young man, roughly the same age as me, about dinner after school. She agreed. Be mindful that I never felt an ounce of jealousy. It only struck me as odd because to my recollection, the majority of young women were typically very selective. This one though, was definitely not typical. It also seemed odd that he'd have interest in someone so unstable, but then again, reason doesn't always stop hormones. After class was dismissed at roughly noon, everyone roused, Allison being the last. Something about her smile towards the young man she agreed to go with looked artificial. It was only a slight curl, but it wasn't the way one would really smile. One side of her mouth was curling upward, but the very edge of that side pointed directly down. It even twitched here and there like some sudden spasm. It didn't strike me until after certain events of their date that her agreeing could have been for some strange, other motive that no witness would be able to explain well afterwards. At the entire class leaving the room, the odd magnetism began again. Following her seemingly frail being through the front door of the building, going to other classes I had that day didn't matter. Attending them didn't even go through my mind. The only instinct was to simply follow. The similar electric path before me was what led me to my car. The entire time though, I watched as Allison got into hers without company, in another parking space just a few away from me. Beginning to follow where she drove, the grayness of the infinite space around me grayed more than before. It darkened and dimmed by the yard. With that, a cease to my stream of thoughts took over, guiding my hands through each turn and such. It became apparent that whatever force did this didn't quite have the capacity to signal, or even stop if she didn't do so first. The whispers from earlier came back, seeping through the radio in my car which I never had playing in the first place. They always spoke to me in riddles. Unlike moments in the past though, they were clearer. They were finally starting to be in complete sentences, only sometimes interrupted by indistinguishable mumbles. Oh, little, unknowing wise snore boy. You find yourself so fascinated. I can tell. This odd encounter while I was driving was different in another way as well. With the fading into a lifeless gray, my conscious mind felt as if it was shutting down. It was just like falling asleep, but immediately dreaming. Although I found myself in this sort of paralyzed state, my hands and feet still moved to drive along with her car. I saw something else in front of me. Just a few inches away from me, a translucent image of her face gathered from billions of tiny particles from above my head until they took a complete form. With the vague translucence of her appearance were some details of the highway I was swerving onto. As she resumed speaking, that faint ringing returned. It was a sound that accompanied her voice during this particular kind of encounter from that time forward. Nearly sideswiping another car while changing to the lane just at my left, my skin tingled at her breath as she told me, it wasn't my intention, but it happens almost at least once with every new place I go to. Perhaps it comes with what was given to me by. The remainder of what she was saying went off into more mumbles, although I could see her lips moving in just the same fashion. All I was seeing immediately disappeared. It was in a flash of time, but felt like far longer. My field of vision was engulfed by an odd face I couldn't dare to call human. To my assumption, I didn't see the entirety of the face. Perhaps I should be thankful I didn't witness more of its form. It was pale as white paper. Staring directly at me were a pair of scowling, veiny, pure ebony eyes. They glared into my essence, planning something. Just below them was a nose-like appendage, though in shape, it looked to be more a beak. I didn't see any kind of nostrils, or opening along it anywhere. It still hung down, shaped much like a sort of hook. It glared at me with such disdain, but needing at the same time. At first, I couldn't tell if what I'd hear was coming from the ghastly image I was seeing in my pseudo-unconscious state, or somewhere else entirely. To give the terrible image company though, for the first time, I heard a soul-shaking, horrified river of a single man screaming. It sounded like this person was driven completely out of their mind in terror that one could only imagine. I couldn't pinpoint where it came from at first, but to my shock and misfortune, it would be a sound I'd recognize in the very near future. Someone in the kitchen's shouting. It's a man's raspy voice. Probably the cook. A loud burst from the kitchen with some kind of enormous splatter. Shit, I can't see what it is. The waitress, the one with the frizzy hair. She ran back to the kitchen. Oh God, her screams. They're so frantic. Mortified. Wait, no. What the hell's going on? They've gone silent, followed by the same sound. That burst with a huge splatter. Still can't see. I hear her humming. Don't forget where I've been. Jesus, I don't know which township I'm in. I know I'm being followed. There's no way to reasonably deny it anymore. I hauled ass out of there. I'm sitting in some other motel I managed to find. I think it was about an hour's worth of speeding, but I'm not sure. I think I spotted a couple roaches crawling across the floor, but it'll have to do. It's not like I'll be sleeping here, like I'd be given enough time. I'm probably further from Stantron, Ohio, and a bit closer to bumblefuck nowhere. Judging by the significant lack of buildings compared to Sadrumsburg, yeah. Bumblefuck nowhere sounds right. Would've been smarter to ask, but someone in this shithole's bound to remember me checking in as long as she only comes for me. The vision of that hideous, unknown, pale face though. It couldn't have been one of a man. Thank God though, I at least didn't have to see it for very long. It vanished into nothing. The only things before me were black. Perfect black, and her piercing eyes staring into me. Her cryptic murmurs kept moving into my ears like an unwanted guest. By the raven. She breathed heavily, and shouted at me. It sounded like Allison was clenching her teeth. You don't know the consequences of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time, do you? Speaking to me in a far more pleasant tone. The girl gave me an innocent giggle. Then again, maybe I kinda wanted you to follow me. I like it when people have an interest. The abnormalities of my field of vision flashed into non-existence. The feeling was that of sleeping in a position that would end up hurting your neck after a full 7 hours. It was essentially that, but the sensation smothered my body. There was a bit of difficulty moving about in general from the beating soreness, and a small pool of sweat along my chest. Looking around, I didn't find myself on the highway, or any road at all. At first, there was a lot of shock merely at realizing my car wasn't even in motion. However, I found myself in the sun-dressed parking lot of some nearby park, surrounded by lively, green grass. Layered in my own body odor, it amazed me that I was even alive. Along with changing lanes without scrutiny of my surroundings, my last conscious memory before arriving was seeing my vehicle's velocity edging on 80 miles per hour. No matter how much time passes though, I can't seem to recall more of the drive. Even though logically, it shouldn't come as a surprise, there lingers in a corner of my mind a foolish ounce of hope that I would. Until then, it didn't occur to me just how unnatural those sensations really were. One may argue I may have fallen asleep at the wheel, or experienced an episode of some mental illness. Either would suffice as explanations at first. Here's what such a doubting party should consider though: mental illness has no tendency in my bloodlines, nor do I have any such experience with it, and only after awakening from this peculiar spell did I feel fatigue. Unlike coming out of any sleep, there was hardly any energy left in me to stand up, let alone get out of the car. I could still look, and see what else my surroundings contained. Before I could take notice to anything really significant, more of her words reached out to me, a bit more faint the time around. Wasn't always like this. Unknowing Wisner boy. Raven made. This way. Just. Was desperate. Came to me after. Dying from. It's not entirely certain to me, but it sounded like I heard a sniffle before hearing her voice. It's so nice. Have someone to open up to. She gave me a dry chuckle. Can apostrophe T. You for too long. After that, the voice faded into the gentle winds around my car. More whispers moaned against my car. Although words were even less possible to determine among these than within the previous mumblings, the chance of her being right there compelled me beyond denial. Jerking my eyes in that direction, I saw nothing. Although one may call it the wind, I wondered if it was her trying to send another message through her telepathy. In that moment, as I began to try to piece together what she meant to tell me, there it was. Her car, and only one more were just a few spaces from mine. Spotting Allison and her unfortunate chaser on the bench a few yards away from me, my curiosity once again got the best of me. When I should have driven away, I found myself rolling down my window to listen in. In retrospect, attempting to drive away might not have done any good. If she managed to psychically take me here against my will, I only imagine she wouldn't have let me go very far. Remaining silent, and looking away from them, I heard her poor chaser ask, "Why did you want to go here instead?" She replied, "I just thought somewhere more quiet," and she said nothing for a second. "Well, private, I guess." "Well, okay, it just seemed a little weird that you texted me right before we left, saying you'd rather come to the park. I guess I just wanted to talk. You know, get to know each other a little better. You're nice. I can tell." "Really?" He sounded pleased, but not without doubt in the girl's voice. "How? Call it a hunch, or maybe you just have one of those faces." I looked over at them for a moment. He was reaching over to kiss her, but it didn't faze me. I just had too strong of a sense of confidence that there was something she intended on me finding out. She backed away. Allison told a classmate of ours, "I'm sorry. I'm just not comfortable with that." A bit of frustration was mixed into his voice. I couldn't see the expression on his face very clearly, but I could hear it without any trouble. "Then what did you drag me out here for? You said you wanted privacy, right?" Another sniffle came from her as she said, "I'm sorry." Her words became completely devoid of emotion as she asked, "Let me ask you something." That was when I gave those two on the park bench my absolute attention. It didn't matter if they noticed me. That tone, or lack thereof, had me intimidated, but far more fascinated. Questions raced through my mind, creating a black cesspool of imaginative terror as to what she would do. The telepathic messages that woman projected to me were enough to drive anyone into a horrid panic attack. That growing cesspool from the bottom pit of my imagination could only inquire as to what else she was capable of. Not only that, but the distinct lack of anger in her voice struck me just as much. Perhaps she simply cut off from whatever quality of mercy she had left, and what she did to him would be a true illustration of such. She asked with that flavorless voice, "Have you ever thought about what it'd be like if Earth lost its gravitational pull on an object?" Hearing that felt like a legion of tiny, many-legged creatures from beneath the soil crawled through my car, and swarmed along me. He let her know, I don't get what you mean." Allison said nothing to him. Getting up from the bench, she went to the parking lot, giving me no passing glance. I still couldn't help the strange premonition that she was completely aware of my presence, despite our perfect lack of interaction. I assumed her chaser was watching with me as she bent down just in front of his car. Gripping part of the bottom, she tugged against it. My jaw hung instantly. Even though the girl didn't have much of any visible muscle mass on her, the shining, scarlet sports car was lifted into the air. What was far more ungodly was when she let go of it. Allison walked away from it, and the vehicle was slowly rotating on an axis, rising away from the ground by the inch. Completely unable to look away, I heard him shouting in between gasps. However, I was a bit too perplexed by the car to pay much attention to what he was saying until he quit stammering, and he was yelling louder. Although I was still facing it, my eyes went back to the two youths. The strange girl's companion was shouting, "What did you do to my fucking car?" I watched as he slowly backed away from her with a ghostly white face. He was trying to create more sentences, but failed to do so in his own terror. She continued speaking in the dead monotone, "Wait. Please. And no. He stopped. His legs were shaking. The young man seemed as if he couldn't move back any further. "I'm gonna go." Allison stood up, staring at him. "I'm gonna go call THTH. Allison Baker stepped closer to him, still silent. "I'm gonna call the police? I'm sorry. I guess maybe I was wrong about you. Maybe I just thought you were cute." She shrugged. I can't say if what happened to him was more bizarre than what occurred with the car floating continuously upward, but if his family gets a hold of this document, it may answer their questions. Hopefully, they'll consider what I'm frantically recording. As she stared at him more, his shape turned completely still. He said nothing, even though there was a look of unimaginable fear across his face. It sounds peculiar, but it honestly looked like he was frozen in time. I say in time only because he proved to be alive, but I haven't doubt that he wished that wasn't so. His motionless being gradually became a sky blue tint, generating a slight, but continuous buzzing noise. In maybe half a minute, the neon silhouette that was my classmate vanished into God only knows where, sparking a powerful gust of wind. It sent Allison back a couple inches, and went far enough to strike my cheek. Having absolutely no idea of what to make of such a thing, I attempted to start my car again. In my utter shock, I lost all ability to move my limbs about. They were rendered completely useless, husks of flesh without any nerves. My expectations told me that not only did she know about my being there, but she intended on me being the next in line. I didn't need to have evidence to more strongly believe that. Even though she was still facing in the same direction, it felt like she was watching me through the other side of her face. She was in fact doing so, as I found out. While my tongue grew purely dry, I heard another whisper of hers through the radio. There was even the sensation of her palm stroking my cheek as the whisper of hers told me, "No, Billy. Not yet." That touch alone was so alien, and that was the only time she ever called me by my first name. If only it was the last time she'd call my name in general, I'd have a shot at having a peace of mind. It'd be extremely slim, but still some kind of chance. I regret continuing to watch. Although what came back to the spot I'd been watching was clearly my classmate, it wasn't remotely close to being the same person. Wind blew in the opposing directions, being intensely attracted to that spot from which he disappeared. Leaves and tiny bits of grass were sucked from every direction, flying towards that point. The silhouette of the same blue tint manifested from the air. The form was indeed still of the young man, but in a much different position. He was kneeling down, his spine arched back, and his hands on his face. Perhaps I could have started my car then. It didn't occur to me to try once more then, but the fainted chance at driving away would have left me in far less awe. The blue shape regained its distinct colors to make every correct detail of my classmate. When he was completely returned though, it didn't seem like he was aware of it at all. In his own suddenly decayed mind, he was still wherever indescribable dimension she placed him in. He fell to the ground, curling up into the fetal position. The entire time, he was screaming at the top of his lungs. To my own fears, I recognized the sound. It was the very same as the one accompanying my vision of that ghastly, pale face with the veined, ebony eyes. He rolled from the side to side, yelling incoherently. Clawing at his own eyes as though wishing to no longer see, he formed no words. There were only non-verbal expressions of mortal horror. As he still screamed, the classmate of mine began to foam at the mouth. I saw him doing so as he stayed on one side, and the bits of white foam dribbled from his mouth to the grass beneath him. Like it was doing so on its own, my arm instantly shoved the key into the ignition. Effortlessly, I took off from the parking lot, and back onto the highway. At the time, the plan was to simply get away, and then contact the police. Then, it occurred to me. Exactly what would I tell them? How could I possibly describe what happened in a manner that they'd actually believe? The dreadful truth came lurking around the corner. There was no way. Although I saw all of these horrid things take place, this was the kind of tale you'd hear from a man who hadn't bathed, or maybe even eaten in days from having his only choice of residence being the streets. Regardless, I was making an aimless escape down a 55 miles per hour speed limit, but carelessly going 78. In a frenzy, I swerved around cars, and heard that horrible murmuring again. It said to me, as if giving an urgent command, "A secret is sacred, unknowing wisener." That was what distracted me, and caused a bit of a plight. It distracted me from changing lanes onto the exit I needed to take at the time. So, rather than safely turn down the bend towards Sturmsburg, I lost control, finding myself waking up sitting in my halted car. I probably would have continued to speed recklessly, I admit, if it weren't for the fact that my car was stuck in a ditch, and smoking from the engine itself. From then on, that little Chrysler of mine wasn't usable anymore. Having found out that walking from me became incredibly difficult, I hobbled out the driver's side. Ignoring the wreckage and the immense soreness in my back, I took my feeble body down the highway, and managed to get a ride from some stranger passing by who had to be vaguely in her 50s. As one may expect, she asked if I knew anything about the Chrysler only yards from where I was limping. Keeping my self-respect, the answer given was a no. The stranger agreed to take me home at first, but then insisted on driving me to the Sturmsburg General Hospital. I tried to protest, but the graying woman would hear nothing of the sort. Being taken in, I heard loud cries from a nearby wing of the hospital. Only thinking about how long I'd have to stay in a hospital gown and how long the crippling pain would last, I thought nothing of them. Periodically though, I'd hear the agonized cries now and again, and it certainly didn't ease the pains along my spine. They echoed through the dark hallways of that part of the hospital, haunting me like a vengeful banshee as I tried desperately to sleep. They at least did so until 2 to 3 nurses and a doctor rushed down that very hall. Usually, I didn't hear what they said in their worried tone of voice, but once, I managed to catch something during one of these incidents. It was one of the practitioners saying, "Jesus, another sedative?" Beginning to recognize whose screaming that probably was, I lost all muscular contraction. Except for my breathing and blinking, everything outside of the brain seemed completely dead, lying still on the hospital bed. Everything around me grayed. It became just as lifeless in color just as the rest of the world around me did when I instinctively searched for Allison on my first encounter. A faint, playful giggle came down the hall, and towards the room I stayed in. My eyes pivoted to the open door. There she was, leaning against the frame with an even more playful smirk across her face. She was the only remotely colorful thing in sight. It made me think that it was just how badly she may have wanted the attention strictly to herself. "Come on, Wisener." She took a couple steps closer to me. I had no real way of determining if this was a true, physical manifestation, or simply another telepathic vision. You know it was. Allison put the tip of her pointer finger against her chin. Necessary. He was gonna expose me, or try to, anyway. I don't need people thinking I'm some kind of freak. She walked over, sitting on the edge of my bed. Right? You understand. She gave me a much bigger smile, bigger than I've ever imagined seeing her give to anyone. Of course you do, and that's why I can trust you not to tell anyone, right? She gripped the top of my head, and stared into my eyes. Having no idea what would happen, I found myself speechless. All I was able to do was give a stupid look. Outside of what wide variety of horrifying things I pictured her doing to me, she simply nodded my head for me. Along with this, she gave a badly done impression of me. Of course, Allison. I won't tell anyone, even if they'd believe me anyway. That's 'cause you're my best friend. She chuckled, and smiled even wider. Oh, that's so sweet of you. So good to know I picked someone I could trust. She let go, turned her back to me, and walked to the exit of the room. Looking back at me, she winked, and left. That wasn't the end of it though. Minutes after her being gone, I still laid there, paralyzed only in terror at the thought of her coming back. The only thing that seemed completely safe to do until the color of my surroundings returned was to face away from the door, and be as still as possible. I was too terrified to respond to other people, including the nurse who came in shortly afterwards to check on me. She greeted me, but didn't take very long to leave me be, assuming my damaged body as asleep. There was a little bit of remorse in me for not even giving her the chance at a hello. From then on, I wondered from time to time what she looked like. Waiting even more, the ghastly sound of her whispers came to me again. The noises were a stalking lioness. They murmured in a purely calm tone, San nih tai, unknowing wizener. What is that, really? Her voice seemed to be hovering just behind and above me, though I never heard any more footsteps except for my nurse. I suppose once like that. It was before I was visited, see. That was when I at least dared to do something. Even though it wasn't much, my shaking hand smothered my ears, only failing to block out the sound. She chuckled, devoid of any enthusiasm. I'm afraid. Yes, afraid it's time to face. Time to face reality. I anticipated more from her, but there was nothing. Despite the color of my atmosphere fading back in, I had very little comfort throughout the night. It wasn't nearly enough to sleep. By morning, my eyes were hanging to the point where I had no choice. When I finally woke up, I had a different nurse that night, and at least she was kind enough to humor me, and keep my door locked. Well, she at least said she did. For the next few nights, I waited for another visit from Allison. At that point, it only seemed inevitable. Maybe my paranoia was only growing though. Every night, I'd question as to whether or not the world around me was dimming into that same gray to let me know of her presence. It only became darker with the night, as nature intended. It later came to my realization that for those past few nights, the crying that echoed down the halls were no more. During a visit from the nurse for that particular night, I asked who it was that cried so much during the previous nights. Confident in the person's identity, I needed the confirmation. At first, she only said it was one of the patients admitted earlier, and to the psychiatric ward. I used the name of a classmate of mine who formerly pursued Allison. A look of astonishment came to her visage, and she asked how I knew. Although such information is usually confidential, or I assume that it is, perhaps it was the astonishment itself that compelled her to break that rule. Explaining that I recognized the voice since it was that of my former classmate, it was my inquiry as to whether he was okay. She sighed, telling me he's as okay as he'll ever be. She also insisted I promise to keep what she was going to tell me a secret. With my agreeing, she told me that from some unknown cause, he went into a hysterical period of screaming, and was anonymously given an ambulance. He was given more and more sedatives throughout the day, and examined intensely for whatever caused his condition. The cause, unfortunately, was not specified at all. Although she doesn't have much involvement with the patient herself anymore because of the transfer to the psychiatric ward, she told me that his condition has rendered him to a vegetative state. The nurse gave me her condolences for the classmate she inferred I had an acquaintanceship with. The remainder of my stay in Dermsburg General Hospital was that of gradual peace. Although I still had trouble getting to sleep, the periods of time in which I did sleep increased from 1 to 3 hours a night. They believed that the sleepless stress was caused by the crash itself, and thus, prescribed me sleeping pills with my muscle relaxants and painkillers. It was only a stay of a week total in that hospital, but the hospital itself wasn't actually located in the city. Although the name did indeed include Dermsburg, the location of the building itself was really in one of the suburbs just outside of the city. Specifically, it was Jovial Springs, Pennsylvania, and thus, no longer had bus lines. You see, now is where the car I've been driving originates. I had a decent sum of money, but only enough for so much food and gas, not close enough for any kind of vehicle. Released from the hospital at just after 1 in the afternoon, I decided to spend the remainder of the day around local eateries. After so much eating and window shopping, The beautiful moon at last made its return. With the nightly dark covering everything, it seemed like the perfect time to take the chance. In my high school years, I suppose my uncle thought that there'd be a time where I just might need such knowledge. It was knowledge I applied in a quiet parking lot to hotwire one of the empty cars. I'm not certain if the police are anywhere close to catching me for stealing a small, orange Ford, the model of which I've no knowledge. There was no manual for it to be found. It got me this far away from danger though, and frankly, that's all I care about at the moment. It's a pipe dream, but it may even be possible to start anew at Stanford University. I don't know what that sound is. I didn't hear any other cars pull up here tonight. It's just been me typing. The staff? No, can't be. There's only a couple staff, and they'd only come around this way if I call. Still, there are footsteps just outside my door. Although it's dark, the glowing screen in front of me is growing dim. It must be her. It has to be Allison. I can hear her playful giggle just outside my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped. Her shadow is still. Oh, God, I can't wait, unless the window. Credit to Dion Winfield. 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 Window. I had always loved horror movies. In my younger days I may not have realized it, but I was a glutton for the terror that the films would instill in me. I subconsciously loved how they kept me up at night, small fearful eyes scanning my bedroom shadows for whatever sort of creature may be calling the darkness its home. It was to the point where I would wake up in the early hours of the morning, around 1 a.m. or so, to sneak into the living room and watch the late-night screamers that would air. Often I would get caught by my mother or father about a half hour into my shenanigans, seated on the couch and wrapped in my blankie while clutching a teddy bear with eyes fixated on the television screen. I would be sent to bed immediately, told that my punishment would come in the morning. It never did, my parents too tired at the time to actually remember apprehending me. On a rare occasion though, I'd managed to make it all the way through a film, from the time I'd slipped into the couch to the moment the credits rolled. At that point, the trudge back to my bedroom was a mad dash of fright, trying to evade any and all monsters or bugaboos that, in my impressionable mind, would grab at me and take me away. I was always successful on the return trip. It made me feel like Indiana Jones. I don't love horror films anymore. Not after what happened. I was in college when the event occurred. While most people associate university with wild parties, copious amounts of alcohol, and finding as many people to have anonymous sex with, my version of the experience was more tame by those standards. The evenings not spent furiously poring over my projects and classwork were spent with my one true love. My Netflix account. From the moment my last class of the day ended, I was wrapped in the sweet embrace the internet had waiting for me. I would return to my dorm, slip into my bedroom and into something more comfortable, and spend until about 4 in the morning watching whatever horrors the streaming site had available to me. And for the price of $7.99 a month, it was the best, and most cheap, addiction I'd ever encountered. The people I chose to interact with when I wasn't glued to my laptop were often of the same ilk that I was. Individuals who were just as obsessive over movies. We loved to be scared, and we often spoke of it. We compared reviews, discussed theories, and often got together to partake in these pieces of nightmare fuel, usually once a week on a Saturday in a grand marathon session that was catered by the local pizza place and a large snack trip beforehand to prepare for when we were sick of the smell of grease and cheese. Many of us were members of a horror enthusiast forum, to meet and talk with more people who shared our twisted ideas of entertainment. I've since removed myself completely from that site. Due to the vast duration of time that I'd been with my Netflix account, I'd practically exhausted their selection of movies to stream that were of my tastes. I'd watched the classics, the cult favorites, the flops, the silent, the screamers, the spookers, the slashers, the foreign. Short of paying extra for a DVD plan, my partner in crime was becoming repetitive. I'd even resorted to watching the 1 stars, The films that were too terrible to even consider horror but still somehow made the list, filled with poorly crafted CG effects that were more terrifying than the monsters they were trying to scare me with. I lamented this to my forum mates, complaining of the lack of fresh choices upon the site that filled my browser history. Many of my friends from school were having the same problems, and were voicing their woes within the same thread that I had begun. Looking back on it, I realize now that this was the worst mistake I could have ever made. Had I not started that thread, some of us might have still remained among the living, finding new ways to garner our thrills. Scream Queen 69, her username from the forum, as I won't refer to anyone by their true name to protect families, had approached us at the meeting grounds the following day. Our usual location of gathering was behind a campus building, an area of concrete that sloped downwards to a door that we all assumed led to the art department basement, the top of the wall that enclosed our cold stone hill blocked off by fence so none could accidentally fall and injure themselves. As our group sat and talked, Square had arrived, looking a little worse for wear. There were dark circles under her eyes, looking tired, and her face was pale. She often looked so bright and sun-kissed, full of energy. She had said that shortly after she posted on the forums the night before, she'd been contacted by another member asking if she wanted to watch something that, as she spoke and gave air quotes with her fingers, would change the genre for her forever, and then proceeded to send her a link to an obscure site she'd never heard of before. Tween Wolf rolled his eyes, suggesting that they were only trying to suggest a film for her to watch and that she was being crazy for ignoring them. I was growing concerned, however, as she recounted that though she originally ignored the person, they sent her messages constantly afterwards. They started out mild enough, along the lines of "Did you watch it? And what did you think?" And as the night went on, they got more violent. Square showed me the chat history, and towards the end it seemed that her chat partner, named Behind You, was getting more and more agitated. The messages were becoming desperate. "Did you click the link yet? You should click the link. You won't regret it. Click the link. Click on the damn link already. Click the fucking link. Click the link, 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 click the link. It was at that point that I grew incredibly concerned for my friend. No one else had received these messages, only her. My only advice to her was to ignore it and perhaps stay off the site for a few days. If this person didn't see her online, perhaps they would lose interest and back off. It wasn't the case however, as Square would come to us for the next couple of days looking more and more haggard, saying that she couldn't rest at night. Behind You was still messaging her, and at this point it was just a repeat of the original link, pasted over and over and over. She was starting to get emails sent to her school email account. She didn't know how they'd gotten it, her email address wasn't listed on the forum, and it wasn't even the same one she'd registered to the site with. The sender would be blank, the subject line empty, and the message was always the same. Click the link. Her inbox was flooded with at least 100 emails by the time she returned from classes, all the same. And then texts. An unknown number of all zeros, at all hours of the day. Click the link. Even when her phone was on silent, the sound would still ring out. It was turned off and it would ring. She would remove the battery completely and still be startled by the noise of her text tone. She had submerged her phone in water to try and damage it and get rid of the noise. Still it rang. She had put it in the microwave and turned it on for 5 minutes, knowing that if the appliance was broken she would have to pay for a replacement, seeing as the appliance was provided by the dorm building. Even burnt and melted in places. The battery removed and fried, it rang. It was getting to the point where Square was growing more and more frazzled, each and every cell phone going off around her causing her to shriek. By the 5th day, she hadn't shown up to lunch. Most of us assumed she was just trying to catch up on sleep from the incident keeping her up at night. We didn't realize she had died until 2 days later when her roommates complained about a smell coming from her room. The police blocked off the dorm room, and her roommate was moved out to live with someone else in the building. They ruled it as a suicide, claiming that Square had overdosed on sleeping pills. She had been found slumped over on her desk in front of her laptop, with the forum pulled up on her browser. I had managed to worm my way into her room a few days after cleanup had ended. Her family lived on the other side of the country and wouldn't be in for another day or two to gather her things, and I had convinced the building RA that Scream Queen 69 had been in possession of a few of my items and I just needed to get them back before they were mistakenly removed with her belongings. The RA had left me there, saying that the doors would lock behind me once I left. Alone in the room where my friend had passed, I removed the laptop from her desk, not wanting to sit in her death throne, and moved it over to the bed. Square never kept her items password protected and left herself logged in on everything, so it was easy enough to turn the computer on and navigate my way back to the very forum she had been looking at when she died. I had found my way to her inbox, looking at the hundreds of messages from her apparent stalker, when I noticed something different. Out of the mass of links, one of them was purple. It had been clicked. I grew curious. What was it about this movie that made this person so obsessive to show it to Square? Was it the thing that had driven Square to kill herself? I clicked the link. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The video was dark, as though it were trying to slowly process the images. Then things were starting to come into focus. A desk. Posters on the wall. A person sitting on the bed. A person standing behind them with a large, toothy grin. It was at this point that I realized I was staring at my own face, sitting in Square's bedroom, her posters behind me. The webcam light was on behind me. The webcam light was on. The inventor was frustrated. He had spent years, decades, researching the nature of time, and his work had finally come to fruition. He had invented a, theoretically, functioning time machine. With this he knew he could silence all the naysayers who had repudiated the underlying goal of his research. They had told him, time without number, that time travel was impossible. Otherwise, one could create a paradox by, say, going back in time and killing one's grandfather before he had any children. In which case, the time traveler would never even exist, and so wouldn't travel back in time to kill his grandfather, thus ensuring the grandfather's procreation, and the time traveler's eventual existence, enabling the latter to go back in time and kill. He had long ago dismissed such nonsense, but as he achieved greater and greater success in his research, always in the comfort of his lab at home rather than at work, the problem grew in his mind. It did not occupy his conscious mind, but his unconscious thoughts were frequently considering it, weighing particular solutions, allowing the better ones to step up to the next floor in his mental architecture. This was actually how he did most of his thinking, with the result being that by the time an idea actually manifested itself in his conscious mind, he was essentially already decided on a course of action. Obviously, he had concluded, a man could not travel back in time and prevent the circumstances by which he traveled back in time in the first place. Just as obviously, thus the paradox, there would be nothing to stop a man from doing precisely that once he had already traveled back in time. Therefore, both conditions must be true. A man could travel back in time and kill his grandfather. But then he would continue to exist, and upon his return to the present, he would discover that his grandfather had not been killed. Time travel, in other words, would only allow for observation, not interaction. No one would have to worry about accidentally stepping on a bug and somehow causing a volcanic eruption or whatever. This led to important side issues. Were one's actions actually happening somewhere, or someone? What would happen if one then got stuck in the past where the apparent event had taken place? Etc. But his subconscious was already working on potential solutions to these questions. As to the main question, he had already decided what to do. Before he would bring his time machine to the attention of his colleagues, and the world for that matter, he would first have to divest them of this notion of paradoxes. To this end, he would travel back in time, perform an action that could not have happened, and then return to the present. He would do this with other people so they could verify that he had, in fact, done the impossible act in the past without endangering the present in any way. First, though, he would have to do it alone in order to have empirical verification, of a sort, in hand before approaching his colleagues. He did not want to kill his grandfather, and was certain his explanation would not be believable if he got stuck 80 years in the past. So instead, he would travel 5 years into the past and kill himself, his self from 5 years ago, that is. If, for impossible, he got stuck there, he was pretty sure his presence would prevent any murder accusation from getting off the ground, the alleged victim being alive and well. He took his time machine, which was about the size of a shoebox, and a pistol into the hallway outside his lab, turned the number dial on the time machine to 5, the units dial all the way up to year, the directional switch to past, and activated it. Not much changed, but he hadn't expected it to. He had always relished continuity, which made it a little unusual that he, of all people, would invent a time machine, and so his furnishings had remained almost entirely unchanged over the 30-plus years that he'd been living in this house. He expected to find himself at work in his lab, and so walked over to it. The door was open a crack, and he was able to look in and see that, yes, he was indeed sitting at his desk, looking at something. He raised the pistol, pushed the door open, and before his old self could react to the sound of the creaky hinges, he shot himself in the head. His old self. He paused for a moment to see if he noticed any differences. Did he have any new memories? Did he still exist? Would one notice if one stopped existing? At this last thought, he chuckled, stepped into the room, and then pushed the return button on the time machine. Apart from the disappearance of his body, his old body, and the door closing most of the way behind him, nothing changed. After pausing again to see if he noticed any differences, he didn't. He went over to his desk to record the results of his experiment. He looked at the time machine and called up the exact coordinates it had recorded, and began writing them down. But something was wrong. The coordinates were not what they should have been, not even close. As he finished writing them down, he looked back at the time machine to see what the problem was. The first thing he noticed was that, although he had pushed the directional switch down for past, the switch was sticky and it hadn't clicked over. The second thing he noticed was that, while he had turned the category dial all the way up to year, he accidentally pushed it too far, and since the dial had no stopper, it reset to the smallest unit. He hadn't traveled 5 years into the past. He had traveled 5 minutes into the future. And behind him, the door hinges creaked. Credit to Jim S.